The first cool mornings of autumn had arrived in Yellowstone National Park. Golden sunlight filtered through towering lodgepole pines, painting the forest floor with long shadows. A light mist drifted above the valleys as elk bugled somewhere in the distance, welcoming another peaceful day inside America's oldest national park. For Forest Ranger Daniel Brooks, mornings like this were the reason he had devoted his life to protecting Yellowstone. Beside him, sitting proudly in the passenger seat of the green National Park Service pickup truck, was Max. The 6-year-old black and tan German Shepherd had served as Daniel's search and rescue partner for nearly 4 years. Hundreds of patrols had taught them to trust each other's instincts without question. Daniel smiled as Max rested his head near the open window, allowing the cool mountain breeze to carry thousands of scents across his nose. "Looks like another quiet day," Daniel said. Max's ears twitched. The truck continued along an old patrol road, rarely used by tourists. The area had once been home to several ranger stations decades earlier, before nature slowly reclaimed the land. Few visitors even knew the forgotten trails still existed. Daniel parked near an abandoned fire lookout and grabbed his backpack. "Come on, buddy." Max jumped gracefully onto the dirt road. Golden leaves covered the narrow trail ahead. Birds chirped overhead while squirrels hurried through the pine branches collecting food for winter. Everything felt perfectly normal. For nearly an hour, Daniel inspected fallen trees, checked trail markers, and photographed several damaged sections of fencing. Max explored quietly nearby, occasionally sniffing bushes, before returning to Daniel's side. Then, everything changed. Max suddenly froze. His ears stood straight. His tail became perfectly still, Daniel noticed immediately. "What is it?" Instead of answering with his usual calm behavior, Max stared into the forest. A low growl escaped his throat. Daniel followed his gaze. Nothing. Only rows of enormous pine trees disappearing into the distance. Then, Max bolted. Max, the German Shepherd, sprinted off the trail. Daniel immediately chased after him. Branches snapped beneath their feet as they pushed through thick undergrowth. The terrain became steeper. Large, moss-covered boulders blocked the path. Still, Max refused to slow down. Nearly 5 minutes later, he stopped. Daniel finally caught up, breathing heavily. "What in the world?" The words caught in his throat. Before them stood a weathered stone, half buried beneath moss, almost completely hidden by thick ferns and fallen branches. Daniel slowly brushed away years of dirt with his gloved hand. It wasn't a trail marker. It wasn't an old boundary stone. It was a grave. A single, unmarked grave. There was no name, no date. Only a faded carving almost impossible to recognize. Daniel frowned. That's strange. Every historical gravesite inside Yellowstone had been carefully documented decades ago. He had studied those records during ranger training. This location wasn't supposed to exist. Max stepped closer. Instead of sniffing around like he usually did, he sat directly in front of the grave. His eyes never left the weathered stone. Then he barked. Once, twice, again. The sharp echoes rolled through the silent forest. Daniel gently placed a hand on Max's shoulder. "Easy." Max ignored him. He barked again, louder this time, then lowered his nose to the ground beside the grave and began scratching at the earth. Not playfully, deliberately, almost desperately. Daniel tried to pull him back. "Leave it." Max refused. The German Shepherd continued digging, throwing damp soil behind him with powerful front paws. Daniel had never seen him behave like this. Not once in 4 years. Max wasn't frightened. He wasn't aggressive. He was trying to show him something. Daniel looked around carefully. The entire area felt forgotten. Young pine trees had grown around the grave. Thick moss covered the stone. It had probably remained untouched for decades. Yet Max acted as though someone had been here only moments earlier. Daniel knelt beside the grave. The faded carving became slightly clearer beneath the dirt. It resembled an old ranger badge, or perhaps a star. Time had nearly erased it. Daniel took several photographs with his phone before recording the GPS coordinates. "This shouldn't be here," he whispered. A cold breeze suddenly swept through the trees. The forest became strangely quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing. Max stood again. He walked to the opposite side of the grave, then barked 3 more times, his gaze fixed on one exact spot near the base of the stone. Daniel walked over. The ground looked ordinary until he noticed something unusual. A small piece of rusted metal protruded from the soil. Only half an inch was visible. It was too straight to be a natural rock, too smooth to belong in the forest. Daniel carefully brushed away a little dirt with his fingers. More rust appeared beneath the surface. Metal. Something had been buried there. Before he could investigate further, his radio crackled to life. "Ranger Brooks, report your location." Daniel picked up the radio but couldn't take his eyes off the mysterious grave. "This is Brooks. I've found something unusual." "What kind of unusual?" Daniel looked at Max. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still, watching the buried object as if guarding it. Daniel answered quietly, "I think I've just found something that hasn't been seen in a very long time." Daniel remained beside the forgotten grave for nearly 10 minutes after reporting his discovery. Max never moved. The German Shepherd sat silently beside the weathered stone, his amber eyes fixed on the small patch of disturbed earth where the rusted metal protruded through the soil. Daniel had learned long ago to trust Max's instincts. The dog had located injured hikers buried beneath avalanches, missing children hidden in dense forests, and even illegal wildlife operations that no human had noticed. But this felt different. Max wasn't following a fresh scent. He was reacting to something much older, something that had remained hidden for years. The radio crackled again. "Brooks, do you require assistance?" Daniel picked up the microphone. "Negative. I'm marking the site and returning to headquarters." "Understood. Leave everything untouched until the archaeology team can evaluate it." Daniel looked back toward the grave. "I wasn't planning on disturbing it." He clipped the radio back onto his vest. Following park regulations, he stretched bright yellow survey tape between several nearby trees, creating a protective boundary around the gravesite. He photographed every angle: the weathered stone, the surrounding forest, the strange rusted object barely visible beneath the soil. Even Max still refusing to leave his position. Only after documenting everything did Daniel gently kneel beside his partner. "Come on, buddy." Max looked at him, then back at the grave. For several long seconds, he refused to move. Finally, Daniel rested one hand on the dog's neck. "We'll come back. We're not leaving forever." Almost as if he understood, Max slowly stood. Together they hiked back toward the patrol truck. Neither of them noticed the pair of dark eyes watching silently from deep within the trees. By early afternoon, Daniel arrived at Yellowstone headquarters. The ranger station buzzed with its usual activity. Visitors asked for hiking maps. Dispatchers coordinated rescue teams. Biologists prepared equipment for wildlife surveys. Daniel headed straight toward the office of Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell. She looked up as he entered. "You sounded serious on the radio." "I found something." He placed several printed photographs on her desk. Susan studied them quietly. Her expression slowly changed. "Where exactly is this?" Daniel pointed to the GPS coordinates. "North of Black Pine Ridge." Her eyebrows rose. "There shouldn't be anything there." "I know." She enlarged one of the photographs on her computer. "The grave isn't listed in any historical records." Daniel nodded. "That's what worries me." Susan opened Yellowstone's digital historical archive. Thousands of documented landmarks appeared across the park. Cabins, fire lookouts, old cemeteries, mining camps, Native American cultural sites. She entered Daniel's coordinates. Nothing appeared. She searched again. Still nothing. Finally, she leaned back. "It doesn't exist." Daniel crossed his arms. "It definitely exists, and Max wouldn't leave it." Susan smiled slightly. "I've heard that sentence before. Every time Max refused to leave a location, something important had eventually been discovered." She picked up the phone. "I want archaeology and historical records." Immediately, less than an hour later, Daniel found himself sitting inside the park archives with senior historian Walter Green. Walter had spent nearly 30 years documenting Yellowstone's forgotten history. If anyone knew about an undocumented grave, it would be him. Walter adjusted his glasses while examining the photographs. I've never seen this marker. Daniel frowned. Never. Walter slowly shook his head. But he stopped speaking. Daniel leaned forward. But what Walter stood and disappeared between towering shelves filled with aging books and handwritten journals. Several minutes later, he returned carrying a faded leather-bound map. I've only seen one reference that might explain this. He carefully unfolded the fragile paper across the table. The map dated back to 1978. Several old ranger cabins appeared that no longer existed. Fire towers, maintenance roads, remote patrol routes. Daniel immediately recognized the area around Black Pine Ridge. Walter pointed toward a faded symbol near the edge of the map. There. Daniel looked closer. A tiny handwritten note barely remained visible. Old memorial site. Removed. No explanation. No names. Only those 3 words. Daniel exchanged a confused glance with Walter. Removed. Walter nodded. Apparently. But according to this map, there used to be some kind of memorial there. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. A memorial for who Walter turned. Several pages inside an old maintenance log. Nothing. No answer. The following pages had been torn out. Cleanly. Someone had deliberately removed them. Walter frowned. That's odd. Daniel stared at the missing pages. How often do historical records disappear? Walter gave a tired smile. They're not supposed to. Late that afternoon, the archaeology team finally approved a limited ground survey. No excavation, only a non-invasive scan. Daniel and Max returned to the forgotten clearing just before sunset. Golden light filtered through the towering pines. The forest felt as quiet as it had that morning. Archaeologist Dr. Emily Carter slowly pushed a ground-penetrating radar unit across the soil beside the grave. Everyone waited. The monitor suddenly displayed an unmistakable shape beneath the earth. Emily stopped walking. Her eyes widened. Daniel. He stepped closer. What is it? She looked back at him. There is definitely something buried under this grave. She zoomed in. The outline became clearer. Rectangular. Metal. Approximately 3 feet below the surface. Far too large to be natural. Max quietly walked to the exact same spot where he had barked earlier. He sat down, without making a sound, as if he had known all along. Daniel stared at the radar screen. Whatever lay beneath that forgotten grave, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure the world never found it. The ground-penetrating radar left little room for doubt. A large, rectangular metal object rested nearly 3 feet beneath the forgotten grave. Daniel stared at the screen. What are the chances? It's just an old storage box. Dr. Emily Carter shook her head. Very small. The shape is too regular. Someone placed it here intentionally. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell folded her arms. We're not opening anything tonight. The site will be secured until we receive authorization. Daniel understood the decision. Any historical discovery inside Yellowstone had to follow strict federal procedures. Still, he couldn't ignore Max. The German shepherd refused to leave the grave. Even after the survey equipment was packed away, Max remained seated beside the weathered stone, quietly watching the spot where the radar had detected the buried object. Daniel walked over. We'll be back tomorrow. Max looked at him but didn't move. Only after Daniel clipped on his leash did the dog reluctantly follow him back to the truck. At sunrise the next morning, Daniel returned with the archaeology team, 2 park historians, and a federal preservation officer. The excavation permit had been approved. Yellow safety tape surrounded the clearing. Every step was photographed before digging began. No heavy machinery was allowed. Only hand tools. The first few inches revealed nothing but roots and damp soil. 20 minutes later, one archaeologist stopped. I've hit metal. Everyone gathered around. Using small brushes and wooden tools, they carefully removed more dirt. A rusted steel lid slowly emerged from the earth. It measured roughly 3 feet long, 1 foot wide. Its surface was covered with corrosion, but a heavy locking mechanism was still visible. Daniel knelt beside it. "This wasn't buried recently?" Dr. Carter nodded. "It has probably been here for decades." The team carefully lifted the box onto a protective tarp. The lock had completely rusted shut. A preservation specialist used specialized cutting tools to remove it without damaging the contents. The lid creaked open. Everyone leaned forward. Inside, everything had been wrapped in oilcloth. The careful packaging had protected the contents from moisture. One by one, the team removed each item. An old leather journal, a vintage 35mm camera, several folded topographic maps, a brass ranger badge, a compass, and a sealed metal cylinder. Daniel carefully picked up the badge. Years of dirt covered the engraving. He gently wiped it clean. The words slowly appeared. Jacob Turner, Yellowstone National Park Ranger. The clearing fell silent. Walter Green looked up in surprise. "I know that name." Everyone turned toward him. Walter frowned as he searched his memory. Jacob Turner disappeared more than 20 years ago. I was new here back then. They said he got lost during a patrol. Daniel looked down at the journal. "So why wasn't this grave documented?" "No idea," Walter admitted. "But I remember one thing. He was never found." Daniel slowly opened the leather journal. The first pages contained routine patrol notes, wildlife sightings, trail inspections, weather reports. Then, the handwriting changed. It became hurried, uneven, almost desperate. Across one page, a single sentence had been written in large letters. "Someone inside the park cannot be trusted." Daniel exchanged a glance with Susan. This wasn't just a patrol journal. He turned another page. Several names had been crossed out. Locations had been circled on the maps. One phrase appeared repeatedly: Black Wolf Ridge. Daniel had heard of the place. It was an isolated section of Yellowstone close to visitors because of unstable cliffs. The final page of the journal contained only one unfinished sentence. "If anything happens to me." The writing stopped abruptly. Nothing followed. As Daniel carefully closed the journal, Max suddenly stood, his ears lifted. He looked toward the trees behind the clearing. A low growl escaped his throat. Daniel turned immediately. Someone had been watching. For only a brief second, he caught movement between the pines. A figure disappeared into the forest. Without barking, Max took off after the stranger. Daniel sprinted after him. The mystery buried beneath the forgotten grave had just become much bigger. Max raced through the forest, weaving effortlessly between towering pines. Daniel followed as quickly as he could. "Max, slow down." The German shepherd ignored the command. He had locked onto a scent. Broken branches and crushed ferns showed someone had passed through only minutes earlier. Daniel's radio bounced against his vest as he climbed over a fallen log. Ahead, Max suddenly stopped. He stood perfectly still, staring toward a rocky hillside. Daniel caught up beside him. "What do you see?" No answer, only silence. Then, a distant engine started. Daniel rushed to the edge of the slope just in time to see a dark pickup truck disappear along an old maintenance road nearly half a mile away. It vanished behind the trees before he could identify the license plate. "Damn." Max barked once, frustrated. Daniel knelt beside him. "You did your job." He photographed the tire tracks left in the soft soil before calling headquarters. "Dispatch, I have an unidentified vehicle leaving the Black Pine Ridge area." "Any description?" the dispatcher asked. "Dark pickup, 4-door, no plate visible. We'll notify park entrances." Daniel knew the chances were slim. The truck had several possible exits. Still, someone had been watching the excavation. That couldn't be a coincidence. Back at headquarters, the recovered journal immediately became the center of attention. Walter Green carefully turned each fragile page, while preservation specialists photographed every entry. Most pages described routine ranger patrols. But during the final weeks, Jacob Turner's notes became increasingly alarming. One entry read, "I found fresh tire tracks where no vehicles should be." Another said, "Several wolf traps disappeared before I could collect them." Then another, "Someone knows I'm investigating." Daniel frowned. "This doesn't sound like a man who got lost." Susan Mitchell nodded. "He sounds like someone being hunted." Walter unfolded one of Jacob's old maps. Several locations had been marked with red pencil. Only one appeared over and over. Black Wolf Ridge. Daniel recognized the name immediately. "It's 15 miles north of here." Walter looked surprised. "The ridge has been closed for over 20 years. Why a major landslide?" The answer seemed ordinary, yet something bothered Daniel. If the ridge had been closed, why had Jacob visited it so often? That afternoon, Daniel and Susan searched the park archives again. This time they ignored official reports. Instead, they opened old ranger logbooks stored in cardboard boxes. Most contained ordinary maintenance records. Then Daniel noticed a missing sequence. 3 entire weekly patrol logs from the year Jacob disappeared had been removed. Not damaged. Removed. Susan stared at the empty folder. Someone wanted those pages gone. Daniel nodded slowly. And someone succeeded. As evening approached, Daniel returned to the evidence room. The sealed metal cylinder recovered from the steel box still hadn't been opened. The corrosion made it difficult to remove the cap without damaging whatever was inside. A preservation technician finally smiled. "I think I've got it." The cap loosened. Everyone leaned closer. Inside was a tightly rolled sheet of waterproof paper. Daniel carefully unrolled it. It wasn't another map. It was a hand-drawn sketch. The drawing showed Black Wolf Ridge, a narrow canyon, a small wooden cabin, and an X mark beside the words "Old Fire Cache." At the bottom, Jacob had written one final note: "If this reaches someone I can trust, start here." Daniel looked at Susan. "I think Jacob left us his next clue." Before anyone could respond, Daniel's phone vibrated. It was an alert from park security. A motion-activated camera near Black Wolf Ridge had captured a vehicle only 20 minutes earlier. The image was blurry, but one detail stood out clearly. The same dark pickup truck. It wasn't leaving Yellowstone. It was heading deeper into the closed section of the park. Daniel looked at Max. The German Shepherd was already standing by the door, ready to go. Before dawn the next morning, Daniel loaded fresh supplies into the park truck: a GPS unit, a drone, emergency equipment. The hand-drawn map from Jacob Turner was sealed inside a waterproof folder. Max jumped into the passenger seat before Daniel even opened the door. "You already know where we're going, don't you?" The German Shepherd wagged his tail once. Their destination was Black Wolf Ridge. The area had been closed for more than 20 years after a massive landslide, and few rangers had entered it since. An hour later, the truck stopped where the old service road ended. Daniel and Max continued on foot. Nature had almost erased the abandoned trail. Small trees grew through broken pavement. Old warning signs lay hidden beneath vines. After nearly 2 miles, Daniel compared the landscape with Jacob's sketch. The cabin should be close. Max suddenly lifted his head. He sniffed the breeze, then quietly turned left instead of following the trail. Daniel trusted him. Within minutes, the trees opened into a narrow valley. An old wooden cabin stood alone beside a rocky cliff. Its roof had partially collapsed and thick moss covered the walls. "No one's been here for years," Daniel whispered. The front door hung open. Inside, dust covered everything. A rusted stove stood in one corner. Broken shelves leaned against the wall. Nothing looked valuable. Then Max began sniffing near the fireplace. He pawed at the wooden floor twice. Daniel knelt beside him. One floorboard sounded hollow. Using a crowbar from his pack, Daniel carefully lifted it. Hidden underneath was a small, waterproof container. Inside were 3 items: a key, an old cassette tape, and a folded note. Daniel carefully unfolded the paper. The handwriting matched Jacob's journal. "If you're reading this, they never stopped looking for these records. The fire cache holds the final proof." Daniel looked around. The fire cache. He remembered the words marked on Jacob's map. It wasn't the cabin. It was somewhere nearby. As Daniel placed the items into an evidence bag, Max suddenly growled. Not loudly, just enough to warn him. Daniel slowly looked toward the window. Outside, fresh footprints crossed the muddy ground. They hadn't been there when they arrived. Someone else was in the valley. Daniel quietly switched off his flashlight. He motioned for Max to stay low. The cabin became silent. A shadow slowly passed across one of the dusty windows. Then another. At least 2 people. Daniel reached for his radio. No signal. The surrounding cliffs blocked communication. The footsteps stopped outside the front door. For several tense seconds, nothing happened. Then an unfamiliar voice spoke. Someone's inside. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Max. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still. Another voice answered. Search the cabin. The old wooden door began to creak open. Daniel tightened his grip on the bear spray at his belt. He wasn't about to let Jacob Turner's final clues disappear for a second time. The cabin door swung open. 2 men stepped inside. Both wore camouflage jackets and hiking backpacks. Neither carried park equipment. Daniel immediately recognized they didn't belong in Yellowstone. The taller man swept a flashlight across the room. Someone's been here. His partner pointed at the open floor compartment. The container is gone. Daniel crouched silently behind the stone fireplace while Max lay motionless beside him. Years of search and rescue training had taught the German Shepherd exactly when to stay quiet. The 2 strangers searched every corner. One kicked over an old chair. The other examined dusty shelves. Check upstairs, the taller man ordered. There is no upstairs, the second replied. The cabin fell silent. Then the taller man sighed. They're already gone. Let's find them before they reach the cache. The 2 men hurried outside. Their footsteps faded into the forest. Daniel waited another full minute before standing. Thereafter, the same thing. He clipped the evidence pouch securely inside his backpack. Come on, Max. The map showed the fire cache less than half a mile north of the cabin. The trail climbed steadily through dense pine forest. Broken stone markers appeared every few hundred yards. Most had nearly disappeared beneath moss. Max led confidently. Suddenly, he stopped beside a massive fallen pine. He sniffed the ground. Fresh boot prints. Daniel examined them. 2 people, the same ones. The tracks continued uphill. Daniel decided to follow from a safe distance. 20 minutes later, the forest opened onto a rocky clearing. Half buried beneath loose stones stood a small concrete structure. Its heavy steel door was almost hidden by vines. A faded National Park Service emblem remained visible above the entrance. The fire cache, Daniel whispered. Decades ago, remote emergency shelters like this stored firefighting equipment and supplies. Most had long been abandoned. Daniel tried the old key from Jacob's container. It fit perfectly. The rusty lock clicked open. Inside shelves lined the narrow room. Most were empty. At the back rested a weatherproof metal case. Unlike everything else, it looked untouched. Daniel carefully opened it. Inside lay several rolls of undeveloped film, a small tape recorder, and a thick envelope marked in black ink. Evidence. Before Daniel could examine the contents, Max lifted his head sharply. Voices. They were close again. Daniel quickly closed the case. The strangers had followed them. He glanced around the tiny shelter. There was only one entrance, no back exit. The footsteps grew louder. One man laughed outside. I told you someone would come. The second voice answered. They've done all the hard work for us. Daniel quietly picked up the metal case. He looked at Max. The German Shepherd understood immediately. Both turned toward the narrow side window. It was barely large enough, but it offered their only chance. As the shelter door handle slowly began to turn, Daniel pushed open the small window. Let's go. Daniel squeezed through the narrow window first, carefully passing the metal evidence case to the ground outside. Max followed effortlessly. The moment all four paws touched the forest floor, Daniel whispered, "Run!" They disappeared into the trees, just as the shelter door burst open behind them. "There they are!" one of the men shouted. Branches cracked as the chase began. Daniel stayed off the main trail, weaving between boulders and fallen logs. The heavy evidence case slowed him down, but he refused to leave it behind. Whatever Jacob had hidden inside had cost him his life. It couldn't be lost again. Behind them, the two men continued closing the distance. "They've got the case. Don't let them escape." Max suddenly veered to the right. Daniel trusted him without hesitation. Instead of climbing higher, the German Shepherd led him into a narrow ravine hidden by dense brush. The steep rock walls quickly concealed them from view. The voices grew fainter. Finally, silence. Daniel stopped to catch his breath. "You did it again, buddy." Max remained alert, listening for any sound above the ravine. Once they were certain they were alone, Daniel opened the metal case. The envelope labeled "Evidence" contained dozens of photographs. Most showed pickup trucks loaded with illegal elk antlers, wolf pelts, and bear hides. Others captured secret nighttime meetings deep inside Yellowstone. Daniel frowned. Jacob hadn't been investigating a small group of poachers. He had uncovered an organized trafficking operation. At the bottom of the envelope was a folded document. It listed delivery dates, payment amounts, and several names. One name had been circled repeatedly: Victor Grayson. Daniel didn't recognize it, but Jacob clearly considered the man important. The small tape recorder was still in excellent condition. Daniel inserted fresh batteries from his emergency kit. A crackling voice filled the quiet ravine. It was Jacob. "If you're hearing this, I couldn't stop them. I photographed everything. I hid copies in case they found me. They have help. Someone with authority." The recording suddenly cut off. Daniel looked at Max. So he knew. He knew they were coming. Daniel packed everything carefully back into the case. "We're taking this straight to headquarters." He checked his GPS. The quickest route followed an old emergency trail leading toward the ranger station. As they started walking, Max suddenly froze. His ears lifted. Then he looked toward the sky. A rescue helicopter flew low over the valley. Daniel grabbed his emergency radio. This time, the signal returned. "Yellowstone Dispatch, this is Ranger Brooks." Static crackled. Then a familiar voice answered. "Daniel, we've been trying to reach you for over an hour. I've recovered Jacob Turner's evidence." There was a brief silence. Then the dispatcher replied, "Return immediately. Chief Mitchell says you're no longer the only one looking for the truth." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" The answer made him stop walking. "Someone broke into park headquarters 30 minutes ago. They went straight for Jacob Turner's journal." Daniel reached Yellowstone headquarters just before sunset. 2 National Park Service law enforcement vehicles were parked outside the administration building. Rangers moved quickly through the halls while investigators photographed the broken office door leading to the evidence room. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell met Daniel at the entrance. "I'm glad you're safe." Daniel held up the weatherproof metal case. "They didn't get this." Susan nodded with relief. "But they almost got Jacob's journal." She led him into the archive room. Several filing cabinets had been forced open and papers were scattered across the floor. "The alarms scared them away," Susan explained. "They knew exactly where to look." Daniel frowned. They weren't searching. They came for one thing: the journal. Susan agreed. Someone still wants Jacob's investigation to disappear. Inside the secure evidence room, Daniel placed the metal case on the table. Present were Susan historian Walter Green, Dr. Emily Carter, and 2 federal investigators who had arrived that afternoon. One by one, they examined everything recovered from the fire cache. The photographs immediately caught everyone's attention. They showed dozens of illegally trapped wolves, elk, and grizzly bear pelts stacked beside old logging roads. Several photographs clearly captured pickup trucks transporting protected wildlife at night. One federal investigator looked up. "These aren't random poachers. This was an organized operation." Daniel handed over the financial ledger. The names are coded, but one appears repeatedly. Victor Grayson. Walter suddenly became quiet. "I've heard that name." Everyone looked toward him. He owned a private freight company outside the park more than 20 years ago. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked. Walter sighed. "The company closed shortly after Jacob disappeared. No charges were ever filed. Next came the undeveloped film. A forensic technician carefully scanned the negatives using specialized equipment. The first images appeared on the monitor. An abandoned warehouse, crates filled with animal traps, hidden cages. Then another photograph appeared. Daniel leaned forward. A group of men stood beside several trucks. One face had been circled in red ink by Jacob Victor Grayson. But Daniel's attention shifted to another man standing beside him. He wore a National Park Service Ranger uniform. His face was perfectly clear. Susan covered her mouth. "I know him." The room fell silent. "It can't be." Walter slowly nodded. He was Assistant Chief Ranger 22 years ago. Daniel looked at the old photograph again. So Jacob wasn't only fighting poachers, he uncovered corruption inside the park. The tape recorder contained one final message. Jacob's tired voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, I've hidden enough evidence. They may stop me, but they can't erase everything." A pause followed. Then Jacob spoke again. "If anything happens, please protect the wolves. They're using Black Wolf Ridge as the main transport route." The recording ended. No one spoke for several seconds. Daniel finally broke the silence. "We need to search the ridge." A federal investigator nodded. "If the route still exists, there may be evidence they've never recovered." Early the next morning, a joint search team returned to Black Wolf Ridge. Max led the way. Unlike before, he moved with quiet confidence. Near the base of the canyon, he suddenly turned toward a narrow passage hidden behind thick brush. Daniel followed. The opening led into a shallow cave. Inside, old tire marks were still visible in the hardened soil. Rusted chains hung from the walls. Broken wooden crates lay scattered across the ground. This was a loading point, one investigator said. Daniel shined his flashlight deeper into the cave. Near the back wall, Max began barking. Hidden beneath loose rocks was a heavy steel hatch set into the ground. Daniel brushed away years of dirt. An old government seal was stamped across the rusted metal. He looked at Susan. "I don't think Jacob ever got this far." Susan nodded slowly. "Then, whatever's under that hatch may be the final piece of the truth." The rusted steel hatch refused to move. Years of dirt, moisture, and corrosion had sealed it tightly beneath the cave floor. Federal investigators attached heavy lifting straps while two rangers cleared away the surrounding rocks. With a loud metallic groan, the hatch slowly opened. A narrow concrete staircase descended into darkness. Daniel switched on his flashlight. "I'll go first." Max immediately stepped beside him. The underground chamber was surprisingly dry. Dust covered the floor, but rows of wooden shelves remained standing. Most were empty. At the far end of the room sat three large steel cabinets. One cabinet door had been forced open years earlier. The other two were still locked. A federal investigator carefully broke the locks. Inside were dozens of cardboard archive boxes. Each was labeled with dates from 22 years earlier. Daniel opened the nearest one. It contained shipment records, invoices, handwritten payment ledgers, and photographs matching those Jacob had hidden. Another box contained radio logs and vehicle registrations. The final cabinet held something unexpected. A locked metal briefcase. Inside was a stack of signed contracts linking Victor Grayson to illegal wildlife buyers across several states. Beneath the contracts lay one final envelope. Across the front, Jacob had written, "If this is found, the truth survived." Daniel carefully unfolded the letter. "To whoever finds this, I know I may never leave this investigation alive. If you're reading these pages, please tell my family I never abandoned them. Everything I did was to protect this park." The room fell silent. Even the investigators stopped working. Daniel folded the letter with great care. He knew exactly what he was risking. Back at headquarters, the evidence was reviewed throughout the night. The documents connected every piece of Jacob's investigation. Financial records matched bank transfers. Vehicle logs matched photographs. The hidden warehouse, the fire cache, the cave, and the forgotten grave all pointed to the same criminal network. The case was finally complete. By sunrise, federal prosecutors approved arrest warrants. Victor Grayson, now living under another business name, was taken into custody before noon. 2 former park employees were arrested later that afternoon. One admitted that Jacob had been followed after discovering the smuggling route through Black Wolf Ridge. Although no confession explained every detail of Jacob's final hours, the evidence clearly proved one fact. He had never abandoned his post. He had died protecting the truth. That evening, Daniel walked alone to the forgotten grave. Max stayed close beside him. The weathered stone still stood beneath the tall pines, now surrounded by fresh survey markers. Daniel gently placed Jacob's ranger badge on top of the grave. It won't stay hidden anymore. Max quietly sat in front of the stone. For several moments, neither of them moved. The forest was peaceful. A light breeze carried golden leaves across the clearing. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell joined them. The review board reached its decision. Daniel looked at her. Jacob Turner will be officially recognized as a ranger who died in the line of duty. She smiled softly. And this forgotten grave will become a permanent memorial. Daniel looked toward Max. You were right all along. The German Shepherd slowly rested one paw against the old stone. Susan watched the moment in silence. If Max hadn't stopped here, none of this would have been found. Daniel nodded. Sometimes the best investigator doesn't wear a badge. He wears 4 paws. As the evening sun disappeared behind the mountains, Daniel knew the mystery that had remained buried for 22 years was finally coming to an end. Only one final journey remained: to return Jacob Turner home with the honor he had always deserved. 2 weeks later, the forests of Yellowstone were glowing with the colors of late autumn. Golden aspens shimmered in the morning breeze, while the first light of sunrise spread across the mountains. Visitors walked quietly through the park, unaware that one of the greatest mysteries in Yellowstone's history had finally been solved. At the headquarters of Yellowstone National Park, dozens of rangers gathered for a ceremony unlike any held in decades. A new bronze memorial stood in the center of the courtyard. Covered by an American flag, it waited to be unveiled. Daniel Brooks arrived wearing his formal National Park Service dress uniform. Beside him walked Max. The German Shepherd wore a brand new leather collar with a polished brass tag engraved with his name. As they entered the courtyard, conversations faded. Every ranger present knew why they were there. Chief Ranger Susan Mitchell stepped to the podium. 22 years ago, Ranger Jacob Turner disappeared while protecting the wildlife of Yellowstone. For many years, history believed he had abandoned his duty. We now know the truth. He remained faithful to his oath until his final moment. He sacrificed everything to protect this park and the animals that called it home. She paused before continuing. Today, Yellowstone officially restores Ranger Jacob Turner's honor. The American flag slowly slipped away. Beneath it stood a beautifully carved bronze memorial. At its center was Jacob's smiling portrait in ranger uniform. Below it were the words, "Ranger Jacob Turner, he protected the wild until his final patrol." The audience stood in silence. Several veteran rangers quietly saluted. Others lowered their heads. Daniel glanced at Max. The German Shepherd sat perfectly still watching the memorial, as if he somehow understood the importance of the moment. After the ceremony, Daniel and Susan drove to the small forest clearing where everything had begun. The old weathered grave was no longer forgotten. The cracked stone had been carefully preserved beside a new granite monument. Fresh wildflowers surrounded the site. A wooden bench overlooked the peaceful clearing. A small bronze plaque explained Jacob's story so future generations would know what had happened there. Daniel gently placed Jacob's restored ranger badge at the base of the monument. "We finally brought you home." A soft breeze rustled through the pine trees. Golden leaves drifted slowly across the forest floor. Max walked toward the memorial without being called. He sat quietly in front of it. For several long moments, neither Daniel nor Susan spoke. There was nothing left to say. The silence itself felt like respect. Then Max slowly lifted one front paw and rested it against the granite monument. Daniel smiled. "I think he remembers." Susan looked at the old German Shepherd. "Maybe he simply knows." Daniel gently scratched behind Max's ears. You trusted your instincts. I almost walked away that first morning. Max looked up at him with calm, amber eyes. One bark beside a forgotten grave had uncovered a truth hidden for more than 2 decades. It had restored an innocent ranger's honor. It had exposed a criminal network that had nearly vanished into history. Most importantly, it had allowed a family to finally know what had happened to someone they had loved for 22 long years. As the morning ceremony came to an end, Daniel received a small envelope from Susan. Inside was an official certificate from the National Park Service. It recognized Max for exceptional service in the protection of national park resources. Daniel knelt beside his partner. I've received awards before, but this one belongs to you. He clipped the medal beneath Max's collar. The German Shepherd simply wagged his tail once. He didn't understand medals. He didn't understand ceremonies. He had only followed a scent that no one else believed mattered. Sometimes, that was enough to change history. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Max resumed their regular patrol. The green National Park Service truck rolled slowly along the same forest road where their journey had begun weeks earlier. The trees looked the same. The mountains stood unchanged. But something was different. The weight of an unanswered question had finally disappeared. As they passed the trail leading toward the memorial, Daniel smiled. Ready for the next adventure, Max lifted his head and looked out the open window. The cool mountain air rushed through his fur as the truck disappeared deeper into the wilderness. Some heroes uncover the truth with years of investigation. Others uncover it with nothing more than loyalty, patience, and an instinct that refuses to give up. Because one faithful German Shepherd would not stop barking at a forgotten grave. A brave ranger's name was restored. Justice finally reached Yellowstone, and a promise buried beneath the forest for 22 years was finally kept. The road stretched toward the glowing horizon. Daniel and Max continued forward together. Somewhere beyond the next trail, another mystery was already waiting.